Welcome, listeners, to the Whispering Library. Tonight, we venture deeper into the quiet heart of Oakhaven, a town like any other, where the mundane comfort of daily life was ripped apart by an act of unimaginable barbarity. A seemingly simple crime with a clear perpetrator, yet the shadows lingered long after the sirens faded, whispering of secrets buried not just in the earth, but in the very fabric of the town itself. For within the heart of this darkness lies a truth so twisted, it begs the question, can we ever truly know the monsters among us, or the rituals they hide? And what happens when those rituals target the most innocent among us? Prepare yourself. The truth, as always, is far more unsettling than a lie. Part 1. The Scarlet Dawn. The morning of April 30th dawned like any other over Oakhaven. A soft gray mist rose from the ground, clinging to the ancient oaks that lined the town's older streets, promising a gentle transition into spring. The air was cool, carrying the faint, sweet scent of blooming honeysuckle and freshly cut grass. Parents bundled their children against the lingering chill, yellow school buses rumbled along their routes, and the routine symphony of suburban life began its familiar cadence. 15-year-old Kevin Miller was late. Had spent too long trying to find his history textbook, the one with the torn cover he insisted on using. His mom called out from the kitchen, "Kevin, you'll miss the bus." "Almost there, Mom," Head yelled back, jamming papers into his backpack. He grabbed a piece of toast, kissed his mom's cheek, and jogged out the front door, the screen door slamming shut behind him with a familiar thwack. His route took him down Maple Street, past manicured lawns and white picket fences, towards the bus stop at the corner of Elm. He wasn't paying much attention, probably thinking about the math test or the upcoming baseball tryouts. The world felt safe, predictable. Then the screams started. They weren't the high-pitched squeals of children playing, but raw, guttural bursts of pure terror. They came from the direction of the park entrance, just ahead of him. Kevin froze, his hand still on his backpack strap. A figure emerged from the mist near the old oak at the edge of the park, moving with unnatural speed. Dark clothes, something glinting wickedly in its hand. It was a sword, long, curved, impossibly out of place. Kevin didn't have time to process, to run. The figure lunged, closing the distance in a terrifying blur. There was a shock, a searing pain across his chest and neck, and the world tilted violently. He collapsed onto the damp grass, the smell of cut lawn suddenly overwhelmed by the coppery tang of blood. His history textbook, the one He'd searched for, slid from his bag and landed open beside his head, its pages stained red. His last sight was the blurred figure moving past him, heading further down Maple Street. The horror unfolded rapidly across Oakhaven. Mrs. Gable, watering her prize-winning roses, crumpled silently to the ground, a swift, deep gash opening in her arm. Tom Davies, the Amazon delivery driver, barely had time to raise his hands before the blade sliced through his side as he climbed back into his van. Police Cruiser 21, responding to the first panic calls, screeched to a halt, Officers Maria Rodriguez and Ben Carter spilling out. Officer Rodriguez took a deep cut to her leg, trying to fend off the attack, while Officer Carter sustained a severe wound to his shoulder. The attacks were brief, brutal, and left a trail of chaos and agony in their wake. The attacker, later identified as Silas Blackwood, was finally cornered by backup units near the town square, still clutching the blood-slick katana. He offered no resistance, no shouts, no pleas. Break time equals 0. 3S/. He simply stood there, eyes empty, the blade pointed towards the ground as if in reverence. The next few hours were a blur of sirens, flashing lights, and stunned silence from the residents who cautiously emerged from their homes. Paramedics worked frantically, officers cordoned off swathes of street, and the grim reality settled over Oakhaven. A random act of unspeakable violence had shattered their peace. Kevin Miller was dead. News channels descended, their vans clogging the quiet streets. Reporters spoke of a quiet community's shock, of a senseless tragedy. Silas Blackwood was identified as a reclusive resident, living alone, no known history of violence. The narrative formed quickly, a disturbed individual, a sudden, inexplicable break from reality, resulting in a horrifying, random attack. At the arraignment, Oakhaven held its breath, expecting to see a monster brought low. Silas Blackwood stood before the judge, gaunt, his gaze unsettlingly blank. The prosecutor laid out the charges: 1 count of first-degree murder for counts of attempted murder, 2 counts of aggravated assault, and multiple weapons charges. The air in the courtroom was thick with grief and anticipation of a swift, deserved punishment. Then came the formal question: Mr. Blackwood, how do you plead to the charge of the murder of Kevin Miller? Blackwood's court-appointed attorney, a weary-looking woman named Helen Davies, spoke clearly, her voice cutting through the silence. My client, she stated, looking not at the judge, but somehow past everyone, pleads not guilty. A collective gasp filled the room. It was unthinkable. The evidence was overwhelming. He was caught red-handed, surrounded by his victims. He admitted to possessing the weapons, admitted to striking the others. But the murder? Not guilty? A ripple of disbelief and cold fear spread through the courthouse and out into the stunned town. The seemingly simple horror of that morning had just become infinitely more complicated. The comfortable narrative was broken. A lingering sense of wrongness began to take root in the heart of Oakhaven. Part 2. Echoes in the Quiet Town. Miles Corbin sat in his worn armchair, the remote control lying forgotten on his lap. The news played on, showing the familiar streets of Oakhaven, the face of the arrested man, Silas Blackwood, and then the grief-stricken photo of Kevin Miller. Miles felt a cold dread settle over him, a feeling he hadn't experienced with such intensity since the Hendricks case. That case, 5 years ago, had been a tangled mess of misplaced evidence, a coerced confession, and a killer who walked free because Miles, then a detective, had followed procedure too rigidly, missed the subtle cues, the things that didn't quite fit. Head cracked, left the force. Now he lived a quiet, solitary life, haunted by the faces he couldn't save. The Oakhaven attack felt different, yet terrifyingly familiar in its capacity for pure, unadulterated horror, striking the innocent. But it was Blackwood's plea that truly unsettled him. Not guilty of murder. It wasn't a plea of temporary insanity or diminished capacity. Those were defenses used after admitting the act. This was a denial of the charge itself, specifically the murder charge for the boy. It was technically possible, of course, a legal maneuver. But coupled with the details, the swords, the calculated way the attacks seemed to unfold despite their speed, the attacker's strange, almost detached demeanor, it felt like a deliberate statement. A statement that what he did wasn't murder in the conventional sense. He picked up his phone, his fingers hovering over contact. Detective Frank Riley, his former partner. Frank was a good cop, by the book, solid. Had been on the scene in Oakhaven. He dialed. The phone rang several times before Frank answered, his voice tired. Miles? Didn't expect to hear from you. Frank. Oakhaven. Blackwood. A sigh on the other end. Yeah, it's bad, Miles. Really bad. Kid didn't stand a chance. The plea. Not guilty. What's the deal? Defense attorney doing her job? Probably. Trying to argue intent? Maybe. Diminish capacity later? Don't know. Case is airtight, though. Guy's clearly off his rocker. That much is obvious. Obvious? Miles pressed. Was he ranting? Making sense? Nah. Quiet. Too quiet. Just empty. Didn't fight arrest. Handed over the sword like he was done. Weird, I'll give you that. But crazy is crazy. It's an open and shut. Open and shut cases rarely stay that way, Frank. You know that. Another sigh. Look, Miles, I know this stuff hits you hard, especially after, well, but stay out of it. For your own sake. It's messy, but it's simple. Lunatic killed a kid. Don't go looking for ghosts. Maybe I'm not looking for ghosts, Frank. Maybe I'm looking for something real you guys missed because you're focused on the obvious. We followed procedure, Miles. Evidence, witnesses, perp in custody. That's how it works. And the plea? That fit procedure? Frank was silent for a moment. Like I said, legal games. Don't obsess over it. Stay home. Can't, Miles said softly. Not on this one. Something's not right. He hung up before Frank could protest further. He knew Frank meant well, but his dismissal only solidified Miles's resolve. He started with what little was publicly available. Schooling in the news archive, local forum. He found an article about the dojo Silas Blackwood briefly attended years ago, a small, almost hidden place on the outskirts of town called the Shadow Brook Dojo. The article mentioned it specialized in traditional, almost historical sword techniques. It seemed like a strange detail for a man who suddenly went on a rampage with a katana. He pulled up a map of Oakhaven, pinned the locations of the attacks. The park entrance, Maple Street, Elm Street, the town square perimeter. On the surface, it seemed random, a path of destruction. But Miles stared at the pins, trying to see a pattern beyond chaos. There had to be something. The plea wasn't just legal posturing. It was a denial of the nature of the act. It suggested a different motive, a different reason for the killing, one that didn't fit the legal definition of murder. And Miles had a chilling feeling that understanding that reason was the only way to truly comprehend the horror that had come to Oakhaven. The echoes of that scarlet dawn were whispering of secrets, and Miles felt compelled to listen. Part 3. The Deepening Mystery. Miles started his investigation where the public narrative ended. He drove to the Shadow Brook Dojo. It was tucked away off a rural road, a small, unpretentious building that looked more like a rural community hall than a place of martial arts training. Inside, the air smelled faintly of sweat and polished wood. He found Kaido Tanaka, the dojo master, meticulously polishing a wooden training sword. Tanaka was lean, his movements precise, his eyes sharp despite his age. Miles introduced himself, mentioning his interest in Silas Blackwood's past training. Tanaka's expression hardened slightly. Silas Blackwood, a difficult student. Difficult how? Miles asked. Obsessed, Tanaka said, his gaze distant. He came here seeking power, not the discipline of the body, the focus of the mind. He spoke of needing a tool, a weapon, to correct imbalances. He was too rigid, too focused on the destructive application of the blade, not its path to harmony. I teach self-control. He sought control over others, over the world. He left suddenly, maybe 2 years ago, said he had found a truer path. Did he ever mention symbols? Rituals? Tanaka paused, wiping the blade slowly. He spoke in metaphors sometimes, of cleansing, of stillness, of cutting away the rot. He was reading strange books, things I did not recognize. He was seeking something ancient, something dark. Not the way of the warrior, the way of the butcher. Miles left the dojo with a growing sense of unease. Correct imbalances, cleansing, cutting away the rot. This wasn't the language of a man suffering a simple break with reality. It was the language of belief. Twisted, horrifying belief. He knew he needed more access to Blackwood's life than public records allowed. He reached out to Sarah Jennings, a freelance investigative journalist had occasionally worked with before. She was sharp, cynical, and had a knack for getting past gatekeepers. They met at a quiet diner on the edge of Oakhaven. Sarah sipped her coffee, her eyes narrowed. "Frank Riley called me, Miles. Said you were poking around. Told me to tell you to back off. Says you're unstable." "He's worried," Miles admitted. "But he's wrong. This isn't random, Sarah. Blackwood's plea, it's a key. He didn't deny the act. He denied the label. So what, he thinks it was self-defense against the universe." Sarah scoffed, but there was a flicker of interest in her eyes. Journalists liked complexity where the police preferred simplicity. Something like that. Or maybe he thinks it was necessary. That the boy, Kevin Miller, was a necessary target. The other victims were just in the way. "I think this was ritualistic." Sarah put down her mug. "Ritualistic? With swords? In Oakhaven?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out. Look, I need your help. You still have contacts who can get access to things. Police reports before they're scrubbed, maybe Blackwood's initial interrogation transcript, if there is one, his digital footprint. He wasn't tech-savvy enough to be invisible." Sarah hesitated. "This is stepping on toes, Miles. Big toes. If Riley's already warning you off, the department's going to shut us down hard if they know we're working together. Then they don't know. You give me the information, I do the legwork. We share what we find. If it leads nowhere, we drop it. If it leads to something real, we decide what to do." She studied him for a long moment, seeing not just the former detective, but the haunted man driven by something he couldn't let go of. "All right, Miles. But if this blows up, I'm blaming you. And if you're just chasing shadows from your past, I walk." "Fair enough." Sarah's connections proved invaluable. Within days, she had managed to get him fragments. Partial initial police reports, witness statements Miles hadn't seen, a note from an officer about Blackwood speaking briefly at the scene, not about guilt or innocence, but about the stillness after the cut. She also found Blackwood's laptop, recovered from his apartment. It was heavily encrypted. Miles needed a different kind of help. He contacted Leo Vance, a young, brilliant, but socially awkward cybersecurity expert had once briefly worked with on a cybercrime case. Leo operated out of a basement office filled with servers and glowing monitors. "Encrypted, you say?" Leo peered at the laptop Miles set on his desk, his fingers already flying across his own keyboard. "Military grade? Civilian? What vintage?" "No idea. Guy's name is Silas Blackwood. Involved in that Oakhaven thing. His defense is weird, and I think his computer might hold a clue." Leo's eyes lit up. "Ooh, the sword guy. Yeah, saw that on the dark web forums. Lots of chatter about whether he was inspired or independent. Interesting." Independent? Miles asked, a chill creeping up his spine. Inspired by what? Oh, internet weirdness, Leo said vaguely, already lost in lines of code. Cults, fringe groups, conspiracy theories. This stuff breeds in the dark corners of the net. Give me a few days. This looks like a challenge. He wasn't just using standard encryption. There's some custom layering here. Almost looks ritualistic. Miles felt a cold dread solidify. Ritualistic. The word kept coming back. He delved deeper into Blackwood's physical world. Neighbors were reluctant to talk, fearing they might be next, or simply wanting to move on. He pieced together fragments. Blackwood was quiet, kept to himself. No visitors. Received packages, sometimes large flat boxes. Orders for specialized steel, sharpening tools. He found a discarded shipping label near Blackwood's trash. It was from a supplier of high-quality carbon steel blanks, the kind used by custom swordsmiths. He also started investigating Kevin Miller more closely. Not just the victim, but the boy. Spoke to Kevin's best friend, a nervous kid named Josh. Josh was devastated, confused. Kevin was just Kevin, he said, tears welling up. Why him? He didn't do anything to anyone. Miles looked at photos Josh showed him. Kevin laughing, playing baseball, just a normal, innocent kid. It reinforced the terrifying contrast between Kevin's life and the brutal way it ended. He found another discarded item in Blackwood's trash, a crumpled receipt from a specialized map store downtown. It was for a detailed topographic map of Oakhaven and surrounding areas. Why would Blackwood need that? He wasn't a hiker, wasn't known for any outdoor hobbies. Miles felt like he was putting together a puzzle, but he didn't have the picture on the box. The pieces were jagged, confusing. Swords, obscure texts, symbols, a topographic map, a focused intensity that bordered on obsession, and a plea of not guilty to murder that screamed, there's a different explanation. He knew he was close to something deeply disturbing, something rooted not just in a single madman's mind, but in a belief system that had led him to designate Oakhaven, and Kevin Miller specifically, as targets. The quiet town was beginning to reveal its hidden, terrifying layers. The tension was mounting, and Miles knew the deeper he dug, the more dangerous the ground became. He felt watched, a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, a sense that his investigation was attracting unwelcome attention. Part 4. The Turning Point. Days turned into a week, then 2. The official investigation remained static. Silas Blackwood was assessed by court-appointed psychiatrists, the legal process grinding slowly towards a likely insanity defense. The town tried to return to normal, a fragile veneer over the lingering fear. Miles, however, was sinking deeper into Blackwood's twisted world. Leo finally broke the encryption on Blackwood's laptop. What he found was not what they expected. No manifestos, no communication with other extremists, at least not in plain sight. Instead, it was filled with highly organized files. Databases of locations marked on maps, cross-referenced with historical data, land use records, old town planning documents, even local folklore archives. There were extensive notes, dense and rambling, filled with the same cryptic symbols from his notebook. And then the images. Digital scans of hand-drawn maps, overlaid with complex geometric patterns, lines connecting seemingly random points across Oakhaven. Miles, look at this, Leo said, his voice hushed over the phone. These locations, they correspond to something he calls stagnant nodes. Places he's identified as points of imbalance in the town's energy. Energy? Miles felt a jolt. Kaido Tanaka's words echoed. Correct imbalances. Yeah, like spiritual energy or some kind of pseudo-scientific geomancy garbage, Leo explained, sounding disturbed. He's got theories about ley lines, underground currents, historical traumas marking these spots. And he's got this whole system for cleansing them. Miles remembered the discarded topographic map, the meticulous notes. Blackwood wasn't just living in Oakhaven. He was analyzing it, mapping its perceived spiritual weaknesses. Meanwhile, Sarah, pushing her luck, had managed to access some raw data from the initial crime scene processing logs, things deemed irrelevant by the primary investigators. Among them was a list of items found on the victims. The other injured victims had their wallets, phones, keys, everyday objects. But Kevin Miller had been carrying almost nothing except his school supplies and that history textbook. And in his pocket, overlooked in the initial chaos and deemed insignificant, was a small, smooth river stone. Just a stone. Why would a 15-year-old be carrying a random river stone? Miles looked back at the digital maps from Blackwood's laptop. He zoomed in on the area around the park entrance, near where Kevin was killed. He saw a symbol marked there, one of the more complex ones. He cross-referenced it with the notes and texts he'd been studying. That specific symbol wasn't just a node marker. It was labeled a primary stagnation point. And the cleansing ritual described for a primary point required a specific type of catalyst. He went back to the dojo, showed Kaido Tanaka the symbol. Tanaka's eyes widened. That symbol, it represents stillness. In some old traditions, achieving stillness requires a great disruption, a breaking of the flow. And the catalyst, sometimes represented by something natural, something pure, holding ancient energy. Miles's mind raced. The river stone, pure, natural, holding ancient energy. A catalyst. He revisited the notes on Blackwood's laptop about the cleansing ritual for a primary stagnation point. The text was chilling, detailing the requirement of a vessel of potential at the node, an innocent life, a source of pure energy to absorb the corrupted stillness and facilitate the cleansing through its violent release. Miles pulled up Kevin Miller's address. He overlaid it on Blackwood's map. Kevin's house was located frighteningly close to the primary stagnation point at the park entrance. Kevin walked past that point every morning. He was young, innocent, full of potential, the perfect vessel, the river stone in his pocket. Perhaps had picked it up on a walk by the creek, an innocent act that, in Blackwood's deranged mind, marked him as a natural catalyst, connected to the earth energy of the node. The pieces slammed together with sickening force. This wasn't random. It wasn't just a lunatic lashing out. Silas Blackwood, consumed by a bizarre, self-constructed belief system based on twisted interpretations of ancient rituals and geomancy, had identified Oakhaven as spiritually stagnant. He had meticulously mapped its nodes of corruption. The park entrance was a primary stagnation point. And Kevin Miller, living near that point and perhaps unknowingly carrying a catalyst, had been selected as the vessel of potential needed for a ritual sacrifice intended to cleanse that specific node and restore stillness and balance to the town. His not guilty plea to murder wasn't a denial of the killing itself, but a denial of the intent as the law understood it. In his mind, he wasn't murdering Kevin Miller. He was performing a sacred, necessary act of cleansing, a sacrifice dictated by the spiritual landscape of Oakhaven itself. The swords were not just weapons, they were ritual tools. The other victims were merely incidental disruptions at other nodes during his town-wide cleansing spree. Miles stared at the map on Leo's screen. The lines and symbols no longer abstract patterns, but a terrifying blueprint of targeted violence. The quiet streets of Oakhaven were marked, designated for a ritual that had already claimed an innocent life. He felt a profound, cold horror. He had found the why, and the why was far, far worse than simple madness. It was a calculated, chillingly rational act within a completely irrational and terrifying framework. The turning point wasn't just a discovery. It was the moment Miles understood the true, horrifying nature of the darkness that had arrived in Oakhaven. Part 5. The Aftermath and Lingering Shadows. The revelation of Silas Blackwood's ritualistic motive sent a new wave of shock through Oakhaven, different from the initial terror. The idea that the town itself was somehow implicated, marked, became a source of intense unease. News reports struggled to convey the bizarre complexity of it all. The ancient rituals adapted to suburban streets, the targeting of a child based on perceived spiritual energy and location. The public grasped the insanity part, but the ritual aspect, the chilling belief system, proved harder to accept, leaving many feeling deeply unsettled. At Blackwood's trial, Helen Davies presented Miles's findings alongside expert psychiatric testimony. The prosecution, initially dismissive of Miles's theories, couldn't refute the meticulous mapping, the consistent symbolism in Blackwood's notes, and the chilling alignment with the crime scene locations and the tragic details surrounding Kevin Miller. The defense argued that Blackwood genuinely believed he was performing a necessary act of cleansing, not committing murder as defined by law. The jury ultimately found Silas Blackwood not guilty by reason of insanity. He was committed to a maximum security state psychiatric hospital, deemed a profound danger to himself and others, forever locked away in the prison of his own mind and its terrifying beliefs. The legal outcome brought little comfort to Oakhaven. Justice, in the traditional sense, felt elusive. The victims of the attack grappled with their physical and emotional scars, now compounded by the knowledge that they were merely obstacles in a deranged man's ritual. Tom Davies, the delivery driver, lost his job due to his injuries and the lingering trauma. Officer Rodriguez required extensive physical therapy. Mrs. Gable rarely left her house, the sight of her rose garden forever tainted. And Kevin Miller's family. Their grief was now entwined with a horrifying understanding. Their son wasn't just a random victim. He was chosen, marked, designated as a sacrifice by a madness that saw their home, their street, their town as spiritually diseased. The innocence of his death was violated by the perverse significance Blackwood had assigned it. Kevin's mother, particularly, struggled with the idea that her son's daily walk to school, his very presence in his own neighborhood, had somehow been a factor in his death. Miles Corbin, having brought the truth to light, found himself more isolated than ever. The police department, while using his findings, offered no apologies for their earlier dismissal. Frank Riley remained cordial but distant, unable to fully bridge the gap opened by Miles's return to the world had left. Sarah Jennings wrote a groundbreaking series of articles detailing the ritualistic nature of the crime, but even her words struggled to fully convey the chilling reality of Blackwood's worldview. Leo Vance went back to his code, but the experience had clearly rattled him. He spoke in hushed tones about the digital shadows where such belief systems festered. The unsettling why of the Oakhaven ritual lingered. Miles knew the map on Blackwood's laptop wasn't unique to Oakhaven. He had glimpsed notes hinting at other stagnation points outside the town, references to a wider network of perceived imbalances requiring similar cleansing. Was Blackwood alone in these beliefs, or were there others who shared his twisted interpretation of the world? Had he acted independently, or was he influenced by some unseen group or online community? Leo's comment about dark web chatter about Blackwood being inspired haunted him. Miles sometimes drove through Oakhaven late at night, the town quiet, peaceful on the surface, but he knew where the nodes were. The park entrance where Kevin fell, the corners on Maple Street, the spot near the town square. They weren't just locations anymore. They were marked points, sites of horrific violence, driven by a belief system that saw the mundane as corrupted, the innocent as targets, and suburban streets as altars for purification rituals. The final, chilling shadow was the understanding that while Silas Blackwood was locked away, the darkness he embodied, the twisted interpretation of reality that led him to commit such acts, was not confined to one man's mind. It existed, perhaps in the hidden corners of the internet, perhaps whispered between like-minded individuals, a latent potential for horror waiting to be unleashed again in another quiet town at another unsuspecting node. The Oakhaven ritual was complete, but the vulnerability it exposed, the chilling possibility that such calculated, belief-driven evil could erupt anywhere, against anyone, left a permanent, unsettling wound on the perception of ordinary life. The quiet of Oakhaven no longer felt like peace. It felt like a fragile silence stretched taut over an abyss.